At the age of 21, I had given birth to my daughter. We spent the summer at an island beach, and I read Anne Lindbergh's book, Gift from the Sea. It spread clear across my life like a finely focused lens. It was the mid-60s, in the heat of an escalating war, when presidents and statesmen, visionaries and children, were beaten and killed in the fevered anarchy of the streets. To those raised in the quiescence of the 50s, the line between law and lawlessness was nothing more than a matter of opinion. Looking at history through our newspapers, we ordinary housewives, neither soldiers nor protesters, had no voice and had no answers. We had only questions, gnawing questions that consumed our neatly fashioned lives, turning every certainty into a battleground of ideas. My friends and I, finely dressed young matrons behind our proper English prams, walked our babies along city streets, stalking ideas as if we were jungle cats. What did it mean to be a woman? How did one live out one's needs without violating oneself or those one loved? How could a woman be free and independent, yet part of a constellation of social expectations and relationships that threatened to eclipse her? In little more than 100 pages, in language so simple and lyrical that it was more poetry than prose, Anne Morrow Lindbergh set forth the answers in Gift from the Sea. "Look inside yourself," she said. "Strip life of its conventions. Reach down to the essentials. Find the core of your being. Make it an oasis for yourself and others. Take strength from it and create a space, sacred and inviolable, in which to become and express yourself. Do it gently, do it gracefully, without anger or destruction. Do it because the quality of your life, in fact the quality of Western civilization, depends on your authenticity." I had read her book without knowledge of her past, her husband, or her fame, and yet understanding the genesis of her philosophy became an increasing obsession. How and where did she find these answers? How dare she answer with certainty the questions that threatened the fabric of our lives? I unearthed her books in libraries and bookstands. I read her diaries and letters as they appeared off the press. Through her writing, Anne Lindbergh became my mentor and my friend. I walked alongside her like some metaphysical voyeur, dusting myself off when she fell and applauding myself for her every victory. Her thoughts and her anguish became a laboratory for me to study my role as wife and mother, as well as to cultivate my literary ambition. I came to believe that if I were to understand Anne Lindbergh and the choices she had made, I could chart the process of female creativity, finding feminine consciousness in crises, heightened by the anguish and isolation of fame. I would know not only myself, but something more, the anatomy of a woman who had chosen to become a writer. Now, after 20 years and merely by chance, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, total stranger and intimate friend, was sitting beside me. I introduced myself and reached for her hand. Her touch was like a fluttering bird, energy and movement without flesh or place. She raised her eyebrow like a camera clicking its shutter. My image recorded, she withdrew. Out of indifference, she turned away. Fueled by that chance meeting in 1985, I pursued her, making circles of words and relationships around her, forcing her to acknowledge my intent to write her story. Slowly, I pierced the inner circle. 2 years later, out of weariness as much as curiosity, Anne Morrow Lindbergh invited me to her mountain chalet in a small town east of Geneva, Switzerland. The invitation held the fire of Old Testament sin. It was an act of intimidation hidden between the folds of social grace and literary illusion. "I feel an aversion to having my life written," she wrote. "The aversion has to do with the appalling amount of publicity we have already had and my intense desire to escape from it. The aversion is not to you, but to publicity, public scrutiny, and the falsity of public images. In fact, all images. A man called Stiller once wrote about images in a novel, One of the characters says to another, "You have made me an image. Every image is a sin." In this country steeped in Calvinism, the language of the 10 Commandments had a forbidding ring. "You shall not make for yourself a graven image, for I, the Lord, am a jealous God." My mind both rejected and obeyed her warning. I, too, had Old Testament beginnings. Eastern European Orthodox Jews observed the ancient prescript, much like the Midwestern or New England fundamentalists. I, too, had ancestors whose lives had been spent in prayer and public service. Their voices murmured in my blood, like rain-filled streams ready to overflow. They told me that life, not art, was the true sphere of man. And woman, a woman who makes images. My grandmother would have mocked me with laughter, then narrowed her eyes in anger. What was I doing in this strange and Gentile city without my husband and my children? Why wasn't I content to live God's will? What was I trying to prove? I was not trying to prove anything, I thought. I was trying to understand. I wanted to find a pattern, a way of living that would permit me to balance love and work without the scars of sacrifice. It was a personal journey, perhaps a selfish one, but if I could bring order to one woman's life, wouldn't my words and images serve others? Anne Lindbergh was tired, she would later say, of sugary images that made her appear sweet and kind. She was a rebel, she said with pride and anger. I began to realize that my task was to find the rebel beneath the saint, the steel beneath the porcelain, the psychological reality that obscured the myth. My problems, however, would prove to be less esoteric. I had written no books, and I was not a historian. I was a housewife and a mother of 3, with a fascination for Anne Lindbergh and a desire to write. Paradoxically, my lack of public reputation persuaded Mrs. Lindbergh to take me at my word. I had no past, and I made no promise except my commitment to honest scholarship. In a period of 2 years, I cultivated relations with members of the family. It was clear that I had no political or ideological motives, and, for the moment at least, was welcomed as a friend. But as I met with Anne Lindbergh again and again, 10 times in all, her advisers grew suspicious. Who was this housewife, Susan Hertog, and what did she really want? Was she as earnest as she appeared to be, or was she part of a news media conspiracy? By the time Anne had her stroke in 1991, many established writers were banging on her door, and, in the end, I was not given access to her unpublished papers. Nonetheless, I persevered. The story, I realized, was mine for the taking, and it was more grand than any I might have imagined. To my advantage, Anne and Charles were writers. They wrote about everything to everybody. They had published diaries, articles, and books, travelogues, novels, memoirs, and poetry. I visited private and public archives and traveled throughout the United States and Europe to visit friends and relatives of the Morrow and Lindbergh families. But my most precious and telling moments were those spent with Anne. Our first meeting in Vevey, Switzerland, on a warm August afternoon, still holds the thrill of reunion with a friend I knew so little and yet so well. As I emerged from the tunnel of the train station, I waved to Anne excitedly, but of course she did not recognize me. We entered a small gray car, and Anne drove. I was surprised by her confidence at the wheel. How difficult to see this frail woman in a white cotton sweater as the girl who had blazed uncharted routes to places where no woman had ever been. In my mind, I stripped the veneer of her aged skin to seek once again the smooth-faced girl. The road narrowed into a driveway, and we chugged slowly up an incline. To an American unschooled in the nuances of Swiss architecture, the chalet looked like a cottage, like so many found in the woods of rural New York. It was a modest A-frame, deep reddish-brown, and unadorned, except for a few flower pots that hung from the balcony like beads on a summer necklace. We walked up the narrow stone steps to the main room, which was both kitchen and living space, opening on a balcony overlooking the mountain.